So welcome everybody. This is the start of our Keyman 14 launch event where we have a series of webinars. We're trying this, we haven't done this before. I presume everyone can see the presentation. So we have 9 seminars this week, which is an interesting number. We've got the whole development team involved in giving seminars. So we're going to share with you all about all the different bits of work we've been doing in Keyman 14, and hopefully the things that will be positive for you. The rest of the webinars will be available at the link that's on this page, the same way you came in. And once the recordings have been processed, we'll try and put those online as quickly as possible as well. So yes, this is recorded. And we hope that will be useful to people in the future. So this webinar will probably run for about 30 to 45 minutes, and we'll run this one again for Europe and Asian and African time zones in about 12 hours or so. And I am going to allow some time at the end of this webinar and at the end of each webinar for questions. So you can ask anything you like about Keyman or anything. I might not be able to answer if it's about anything else. And that includes questions about the future of Keyman and suggestions. So this is a good opportunity if you have a feature you dearly want and we have not yet implemented it. I'm going to pretend there are no bugs in Keyman, so that won't be an issue that you'll be asking me about. So about Keyman, just before I talk about version 14, I thought I would introduce Keyman a little bit. So what is Keyman? Keyman was originally called Tavutisoft Keyboard Manager. The name Tavutisoft actually comes out of Papua New Guinea. Tavuti is a village on the north coast of Papua New Guinea where I spent some time as a child. Keyman itself, as it's now known, is a software keyboard app. So it allows you to remap your hardware keyboard, which I have not got a picture of a hardware keyboard there, or also provides an on-screen keyboard on desktops and a touch keyboard on mobile devices. It's designed to integrate into your operating system or your device to try and work without getting in your way. And it's got a very flexible design language for allowing you to design your keyboard. And it's probably the most powerful input method system for non-Chinese, Japanese, Korean languages in the world. Keyman is not just the program. Keyman is also a community of keyboard developers who have contributed around 700 keyboard layouts currently, supporting over 2,100 languages. And of those 700 keyboard layouts, many of them have gone through years of improvements and iterations. You can create your own keyboard layouts using the freely available Keyman developer tools. And you can share your keyboard layouts with your community through peer-to-peer networks and through our networks using Keyman Cloud, where your keyboard becomes available on keyman.com. And that's all completely free of charge. Keyman works on a large range of devices. We try to make it work on all the popular devices. So it works on Windows and macOS and on Linux and on Android and on Chromebooks to some degree. We're still working on Chromebook a little, on iOS, and actually also on the web, so you can embed Keyman into a website. And you can create a single keyboard layout, and in most cases you can just use it on all the devices without needing to create 6 different versions of the keyboard. And as I noted a little bit earlier, Keyman is free. It's also open source, which means that all of the source code for Keyman is available on the internet on github.com/keymanapp. You can download it and compile it yourself. You can change it. You can distribute it yourself if you want to, if you're that way inclined. And we use the very liberal MIT license, which gives you as much freedom as we can possibly give you to do whatever you like with the source code. About the only thing we say is you can't use the name Keyman if you're forking the source and doing stuff with it yourself. And Keyman is developed and distributed and supported by SIL International, and I'm a member of SIL International, and the team, the core team are all SIL workers. So that's a really quick overview of what is Keyman. I'm going to talk now about what's new in Keyman 14. So we've had 13 versions. Keyman was released, the first version, in 1992 or 1993. It's a long time ago and before internet, so we don't have any historical records. And it's been gone through a lot of changes since then. So some of the key features in Keyman 14, and I'll go through these in a little more detail shortly. We've got a simpler and smoother keyboard search. The user interface is now fully localizable, which means you can translate it into your local language. We have one way of distributing keyboards for all platforms using keyboard packages, whereas previously we still had two different methods for mobile platforms and for desktop platforms. Because we do sometimes get bugs, we have now consolidated the crash reporting so that we get a very good view of when errors occur and are much more able to address them proactively. And we now use the same version number for all platforms. So that means that if it says 14.0.270, which is our release version of Keyman, that's 14.0.270 everywhere, which is just one less thing for people who are supporting Keyman to have to remember. So let's talk a little bit more about the keyboard search. So the keyboard search has gone through many iterations over many years because it's actually quite a challenging problem. There's lots of different ways to write your language name. There's lots of ways that people want to look for their keyboard names. And we've now come up with a search which feels a bit like a Google search. You have one list of results and it's sorted by the popularity and the relevance of the keyboards as far as we can determine. You can search for a keyboard name or a language name or a country name, and it's always going to come up with a consistent single list. So in earlier versions, we had you drilling down through multiple tiers of searches and things like that, which felt very nice and computery, but is actually not very accessible to the average user. So we're trying to make this much more accessible. It's also now exactly the same search in the app and on the website. So in previous versions, we had a different set of search results on mobile devices, and we had a different search interface on Windows, but now we use exactly the same search everywhere. And it's fewer steps to get to the install link, which is all that anyone really cares about at the end of the day, I think. But I can talk about it all day long, or I can try and show you. So I think that this should now come up with a website. So please tell me if you, Eberhard, if you can't see that. And I'm now going to search for a language, and I think I'm going to search for Burmese. And I didn't press enter there, I just typed Burmese, and it's immediately given me a list of the languages for Burmese. I'm going to just zoom that in slightly, make it a little bit easier to see on the presentation. And you can see here that we've got Myanmar 3 SIL is the most popular Burmese keyboard we have. It's got an approximate number of monthly downloads of 850 or so a month. That's very approximate, but it just gives you an idea of which keyboards are more popular. It tells you which operating systems or which platforms it works on. Currently, this does not work on Androids or iPhones, although there is a test version that does. So let's go ahead and use the popular one here. And I can now click the big green install keyboard button. I can also learn a little bit more about the keyboard down here. So it tells me this keyboard supports Burmese. Some keyboards support many languages, in which case you'll see a long list of all the languages that are supported. It will work with version 9 of Keyman, although I'm going to do it with version 14 today. And I can go and read the documentation. And like all of the keyboards that we distribute, the source code is available. You can click that link and you can take that source code and you can modify it and you can make your own version of it to suit your needs. So let's click the big green install keyboard button. And now it's coming up with a little box here that says open Keyman configuration. So it's already trying to install a keyboard. I'm going to click that, open Keyman configuration. Downloads the keyboard. And now we have the install dialog for the keyboard. I can read the README that tells me it's designed for typing in Burmese on Myanmar language. And I'm not going to install it just this second. So that's the first way in which you can download and install a keyboard. Now, if you open Keyman configuration, you can also click download keyboard. And you can see this looks very similar. Let's go for Lao this time. So there's not a lot of people downloading these keyboards. That's okay. We're going to go with Lao 2008 Basic. And you can see we've got a single install keyboard button, and then we come back to the same interface as before. And we click install and off we go. Now, if you don't have Keyman installed already, that's okay. Just click the download keyboard button. And it'll ask you to save, or it will download into the bottom bar here, just as it always does. And you can see the file name there. If you can see that, it says Keyman setup, SIL-Myanmar my3.my. If we open that, it tells me I'm going to install Myanmar 3 for Burmese when I install. So it will automatically install Keyman and the keyboard. There's no need to worry about downloading Keyman and then downloading the keyboard. And you can see the install options here. It says it's going to install Myanmar 3 SIL for the Burmese MY language. That's the basic pattern, and that pattern applies across Android and iOS and macOS and Linux as well, with slight variations depending on how the platform works. And we're trying to make that as consistent and smooth as possible in all cases. If you're on Linux, you may find you want to install using the command line, which you can also do. Also with version 14 of Keyman, we've made it localizable so that you can translate the user interface into any language, and will then be available as a part of the Keyman app. At this point, we're releasing the updates as releasing the translations as updates to the Keyman app, so they're not something you can install into the app yourself. And that's mainly because there's a fair bit of complexity in integrating some of the translations. And we're aiming to make that possible to install privately in the future, which would be a lot nicer, we think. But what we can do today already is we go to Keyman configuration. This is on Windows and display in, and you can see we're starting to get more and more people offering translations in various languages, and this is Khmer right now. And as soon as you change it, you can see it's now also in Khmer in the Keyman menu down the bottom of the screen there. And if you get stuck, look for the globe. It goes back to English. So the translation system, translate.keyman.com, is open for anyone to come in and submit a translation. I won't take you through the whole process, but basically you choose the language you wish to work in. These are ones that people have started on. You can add a new language once you are a member of the translation team. So again, if we look at Khmer, which has the 100% translated, well done, Makara. And you can see that we have the list of strings to translate. So it's a very straightforward process. It only takes a few hours to go through and translate. Let's say show all. And you can see that there's actually not that many strings to translate here. So we've got install updates, and Makara's put in this Domlang Jongnan. So I really encourage everybody to go through and submit a translation for their language. It's something that has been missing for Keyman for a long time, especially on the mobile devices. And I really want to see more and more localized versions so that people are able to use it in their language without needing to speak English. So we now use keyboard packages everywhere for distribution. In version 13, the keyboards were distributed as JavaScript files internally. And in earlier versions of Keyman, you had to use JavaScript files on Keyman for iOS, or Keyman for iPhone and iPad, and Keyman for Android. And that was a little bit confusing because you also had to distribute fonts separately. But now what we use is KMP keyboard packages. So a keyboard package contains the keyboard layout, it contains fonts and documentation, graphics, anything else that is needed to actually use the keyboard. It's a single file, it's very easy to use and distribute. And Keyman Developer creates those keyboard packages. Now, I'm going to talk very briefly about each of the different platforms. We have some extra webinars coming up where there's more detail about the platforms. So if those platforms are of interest to you, I really urge you to come along. Also, it's an opportunity for you to meet the developers who are looking after those platforms and leading the development on them. So it's not all going to be me. So some of you probably breathing a sigh of relief. And unfortunately for Keyman for Windows, I will be presenting on that tomorrow at the same time. So earlier versions of Keyman 14, we were called it Keyman Desktop. Sorry, earlier versions of Keyman for Windows, we called it Keyman Desktop. And that was fine when we only had Keyman Desktop and Keyman Developer way back in version 9. Now that we have Keyman for macOS and Keyman for Linux and Android and so on, it makes more sense to bring the name Keyman 14 for Windows back, so that way you know that it's the version for Windows, not some arbitrary desktop. I probably keep on saying Keyman Desktop because I've said it for so many years, but I'm trying to say Keyman for Windows. So one big change with Keyman 14 for Windows is that Keyman keyboards are always listed on the list of keyboards in your operating system. So if you click down here, you'll see the Keyman keyboards are always listed, and that applies even if Keyman is not running. And that is to prevent issues with Windows reassigning your languages, which can happen if the keyboards disappear. So there's one little trick there. If you try to use your keyboard and Keyman is not running, it's not going to work. So you'll have to start Keyman again in that situation. And we always recommend leaving Keyman running at all times. If there's a reason you need to exit Keyman and it's because there's a bug in Keyman, tell us about it. So Keyman for Windows no longer has any dependency on Internet Explorer. previous versions of Keyman for Windows used Internet Explorer to draw the Keyman configuration dialog box. And Internet Explorer, as most of you probably know, is no longer the browser of choice for anyone. And we wanted to get away from depending on that and forcing you to have to go through hoops to install Keyman. So we now bundle Chromium instead. So Chromium is the open source component of the Google Chrome browser. So we can update that regularly and use that more effectively to present the Keyman user interface. That's used also when you look at the documentation in Keyman, the keyboard documentation as well. So it helps for being able to use modern features for doing your keyboard help. It was also a prerequisite for doing the keyboard search because Internet Explorer had some limitations in how we wanted to do the keyboard search. In Keyman configuration, you'll see that there is no longer an OK or a cancel button. So we can see this here. We now just get a happy little message. It says changes are applied immediately. So if you go into your options and you say simulate Alt-GR with Control-Alt, which is a lovely technical sounding message, I've just turned that option on and I can immediately use it. I don't need to click OK or cancel. This also helps when you're installing keyboards because previously you would install a keyboard and then you'd say, do I have to click OK or do I have to click cancel? If I click cancel, does the keyboard disappear again? So there was some friction there. People weren't quite sure sometimes whether they were doing the right thing or not. So getting rid of the button just makes that a little bit easier. It's also the way that most settings interfaces are going today. They're trying to get rid of those buttons and just apply changes instantly. So you'll see that in Windows settings. It's been that way on macOS for a long time. The installer itself is much improved. So you saw a glimpse of the installer earlier when I ran the keyboard download. So it will download Keyman or keyboards automatically. And there's a whole bunch of fun things you can do, which I will go through in more detail in the Keyman for Windows presentation. Also, the on-screen keyboard loads much faster. And it opened on the other screen, so you didn't see that, but there it is. And the reason the on-screen keyboard opens much faster is we're no longer depending on Internet Explorer to draw parts of it. So the font helper is a lot faster. You can see a list of fonts that work with Sinhala fonts I have installed. I only have 4, 5. And you can see the character map loads very quickly as well. I'm not going to play with those features too much today, but the on-screen keyboard being fast, it just means it's less obtrusive to you when you want to use it. Right, onto Keyman for macOS, and because I'm running on Windows right now, I can't quickly flip over and show you macOS screens, I'm afraid. So I'm just going to have to talk about it. Keyman for macOS, we currently don't have a lead developer working on that, so it is being maintained, but we're not able to do much new functionality. We should have a new developer working on version 15 shortly in the coming months. What we have done in version 14 for macOS is we've improved the compatibility with Java apps. So previously, Keyman did not work very well with Java apps, which a number of applications or popular applications out there are written in Java, and you just could not type with Keyman into them. So now you can, and it works reasonably well. The on-screen keyboard didn't support the additional keys that you need on a European layout, so that you couldn't actually type some things on a on the on-screen keyboard if you use those additional keys. So now we support that. Because on macOS we have legacy applications which use some old styles of getting keyboard input. and we have modern applications which use the sort of the Apple recommended way of getting keyboard input, sometimes we can't tell which applications are which. So in the past, we actually coded a list of applications into the app where we had to turn on a compatibility mode, a legacy mode. Now we've got the ability for you to say, oh, I need to turn on a legacy compatibility mode for this application so that it will work. This is admittedly a power user feature, but it should help for people who need to work with an app and don't want to wait for us to go and add that app to the list and release a new update. And we've also made some bug fixes mainly relating to these legacy apps around the cursor keys and the shift and option and command keys when you're using those in conjunction with Keyman. It's just slightly more reliable now. Again, I'll talk a bit more about Keyman for macOS, including how you can actually set up those compatibility modes in the macOS presentation. Keyman for Linux. So Eberhard has recently joined the Keyman team and is taken on looking after Keyman for Linux. So that was quite close to the end of the Keyman 14 development cycle. And so he's mainly been working on just some bug fixes in this release, but we'll have more functionality in upcoming releases. Even so, even though he had a few weeks, he's managed to squeeze in some support for the latest release of Ubuntu 20.10 or Groovy. He's started the process of integrating into Debian so that we can actually install Keyman through the Debian packages using the apt command, apt install, which means no need to use the PPA or PSO or other acronyms which confound many users. We're also working on releasing it on Fedora. So if you use Red Hat Fedora instead of Ubuntu, then you'll be able to get Keyman through their package systems. And he's made a bunch of smaller bug fixes that just make Keyman work more reliably, as well as doing the work around the keyboard search and the localization and those other big multi-platform features. For Android, we made the choice to support a minimum version of Android, which is 5.0. So our statistics say that probably about 0.5% of users are using older versions of Android. And that number is actually a lot higher in some countries. But there are a lot of difficulties with continuing to support the older versions because the libraries that we want to use no longer support them. And also the web browser that's built into the older versions is so old now that it just doesn't work with most websites. It doesn't work with a lot of the things we try to do on a day-to-day basis. So we said we'll support version 5 of Android, which is Lollipop, and we'll continue to try and support version 5 as long as possible. So on Android, as well as the localization and the keyboard install, which have been completely rewritten, we've reorganized the setup pages and the keyboard installation options to make them easier to use. So it's more consistent again with all the other platforms. We've made significant improvements to predictions and corrections, and Joshua did a lot of work on that. So you'll hear from Joshua on the web webinar, Keyman for Web webinar, and the lexical models webinar, which is the last one we're having, and also on the iOS webinar, sorry. And the predictions and corrections now are much better at looking at when you transpose keys. So if you type BXO and you meant box, it will say, oh, I think you meant box. Predictions and corrections on Android and iOS that Keyman does are they're not very presumptuous. So they'll offer you a correction, but it won't automatically take the correction. And that's partly because with the word lists that we work with in many cases don't have everything that is in the language. When we're looking at low resource languages, we need to offer as much as we can, but not get in the way. For languages that use upper and lowercase letters, capital letters and lowercase letters, we now have the ability to respect the case selection. So if you type a capital A for Apple, it's going to give you the capital A Apple option. Or if you start a sentence with a capital letter, it will offer you to complete words that are and maintain that capital first letter, which makes them a whole lot more useful. We're doing a whole lot more with capital letters in the next version of Keyman. For iPhone and iPad, Keyman does much the same things as Keyman for Android because they share a lot of the same code. The improved predictions and corrections and the user case selection for predictions. But we've also done a fair bit of work to try and make the keyboard work more smoothly and faster in Keyman for iPhone and iPad. And we've done all of the work around the settings and make it integrate more tightly into iOS 9. So the current minimum version for Keyman 14 is iOS 9. And according to our statistics, we had about 8 people using that. So we probably will jump up to the next version of iOS for the next release of Keyman. For Keyman Developer, there's a whole stack of improvements, and I will go through these in detail in the Keyman Developer presentation. So just briefly, we've got new images for the command keys for right to left keyboards. So that's the backspace and enter key. So you flip the images so that they actually look like the direction that you're typing your text. We've improved BCP 47 support, and if that doesn't mean anything to you, you can probably breathe a sigh of relief. But it's basically the language tags that you work with. That you say, oh, this language has got the tag EN, which means it supports English. And we've just made it so that that works a lot better for version 14. So when you're designing your lexical models, which is the predictive text dictionaries, we've given the ability to define how you go between uppercase and lowercase, which is very important for a lot of languages because it's not necessarily the same as in English. And if you have a word list which has got duplicates in it, when you're actually compiling that word list, it will figure that out and it won't offer you the same word twice, which was what happened in earlier versions, but it will say, oh, you actually mean that word's more common because you got it twice in your word list. And a couple of language extensions which we've made. So the Keyman keyboard design language, we now have range expansions, and we have a store which tells you which keys are affected by caps lock. And you can see that line of code at the bottom there. I've used both of those. So in this case, I'm saying that all the keys from A to Z are affected by the caps lock key. And that ... is just says everything between A and Z. Also in Keyman Developer 14, we now support ISO key codes. So there's an international standard for defining where keys are on the keyboard. And we've added that into Keyman Developer. So you can say, I want the key E00 instead of the key K_BK quote. Some users prefer to talk about keys by their position, and you can see each row has a letter and each key has a number. I'll talk about that a bit more as well in the other presentation. So what's coming up? Right now, Keyman 15 is in planning. Everything I talk about now is subject to change, including the target release date, which is the end of this year. We will be doing more detailed planning in a few weeks and then hope to do another webinar after that. So the strategic feature of Keyman 15 is to try and work with the LDML keyboard standard. So it's a locale data markup language, which probably means no more than LDML. It means you can submit keyboards to the common locale data repository. Computer people love their acronyms. So the reason we want to do this is platform vendors, that's the Apples and Microsofts, of Googles of this world, want to have a standards-based keyboard system so that they can share keyboard layouts, and they can take keyboard layouts created by the communities, which means people who traditionally had to use Keyman. We want to make Keyman work well with LDML keyboards so that you can create a keyboard for LDML and submit it to the common locale data repository, and then it will appear eventually in Windows and on iOS and on macOS and on Android. So we want to build a keyboard editor in Keyman Developer that targets LDML keyboards. And yeah, the big end goal is that you create that keyboard and eventually it actually appears in the operating system without needing Keyman installed. That's a fairly long-term goal, but that's what we're aiming for. We're also going to do a bunch of other bits and pieces. We want to reduce the technical debt, which all of the code that we write, which gets old and needs maintenance, and share that cross-platform by having a common Keyman core. We want to support preferred versus supported language codes, which is important for keyboards that support many languages. And we want to support mnemonic layouts on macOS and Linux. So that's keyboards that map according to what your keyboard is. So if you're on a French keyboard, it will remap so that the keys follow the French layout rather than the English US layout. On mobile devices, we want to have more work for caps lock. And as I noted before, the minimum versions for Android and iOS, we'll probably try and aim for those numbers 5 and 12 respectively. Keyman Developer, we want that to work better on Linux and macOS, and we'll see what we can do with that. And you tell us what you want. For going on further, I'm going to go really quickly through this because it's now very amorphous. We want to add predictive text learning and user dictionaries. And very importantly for Africa and North America and Australia and in fact most of the world, we want support for morphological models. So polysynthetic languages, languages without word breaks, languages which glue words together and make them very long. None of those work particularly well right now in Keyman 14, and we want to make that work better. We want to make it possible to add themes to keyboards so end users can say, I want to have a picture of a beach under my keyboard, or I want to change the color of my keys. It's amazing how important that feels. For me as a computer programmer, I don't understand that kind of thing, but people tell me they want it. And we want to add long press and swipe optimizations to the touch keyboard so you can type faster, and make the localization customizable further, as I noted before. And for people who integrate with Keyman with their own apps, we want to improve the way that that is done. I want to leave some time for the questions, so that's why I zoomed through that last page a little bit. Then we've got 5 minutes. In theory, we can go as long as we want, really. So any questions? You'll have to unmute in order. I think I've allowed anyone to unmute. So if you want to unmute and ask a question, please go ahead.
I had a question. So you mentioned the predictive text or auto completion. The frequency. So right now, I think the word list that we import that's produced from what's the program we use? It's Primer Prep.
Yep.
That comes with word counts already?
Yes.
Okay, so an alternate way of doing it would be feeding in a big word list that has multiple words and letting Keyman sort them out and come up with the frequency counts?
Yes. I mean, where we see this most often is where you have multiple word lists that come from possibly from different tools. And so you have the same word in multiple word lists, and Keyman will just combine those word lists. But we also do see lower quality word lists maybe coming from other tools where sometimes the words are repeated. There's also that note about normalization. So if you have a word written in two different forms, so with the diacritics combined or composed or decomposed, it will merge those as well. If that makes sense. Thank you, Doug.
Mark, could you quickly state in less than a minute your personnel needs, your programmer and other kinds of needs? I'm thinking about personnel as you dream for the future.
Yeah, sure. So you noted as I was talking that Keyman for macOS, we currently don't have a developer. I'm still spread across too many parts of the program. We really need at least 2 or 3 more developers, and we need a full-time tester. Makara does testing and user support right now, and that keeps him very busy, too busy. And we probably need some people to work on documentation and manage the localization and things like that as well. Ideally, we would have another management person to either lead the team or own the product. So I think we're talking about 6 or 7 additional people would be ideal.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
On the issue of normalization, there may be a contradiction in the help for Keyman developer that I'm experimenting with right now. It says it does not normalize for Unicode, but are we talking about 2 different kinds of normalization or what?
Right, so the keyboard layouts themselves do not normalize. The normalization that we do now, which is brand new in this version, is just in the word lists themselves that are used in the lexical models. And that's done during compiling. We would like to have normalization in the keyboards because that would add a bunch of benefits, but that's a future version feature.
I suppose I can't ask you for a target date for that.
Let's say version 16. Version 15, we're fairly committed on the LDML keyboard functionality. LDML keyboards will be normalized. That's part of the specification. So once we have it there, it will probably filter back into the Keyman keyboards a little more easily.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Edward. All right, well, thank you, everybody. We're always available. You can contact us through the Keyman community, which you can access through keyman.com. If you are social media inclined, we've got that at Keyman or the facebook.com/Keyman app. And some of you have my email address. And the latest roadmap at the bottom there for March 2020, we'll update that after we do our planning, which is in early May. And that point, hopefully we'll do another presentation about what we plan to do. Thank you, Edward, for your feature requests, because those questions coming from users help us to decide what we're going to do in upcoming versions.
Mark, should that slide say March 2021, not 2020?
No, the latest roadmap right now is from March 2020.
Okay.
So we will update it again in May this year.
And of course, we can't see the link.
Yes, I'll share this presentation on the webinar homepage. We'll share all of the presentations, so there'll be links after we finish the webinar series, or after we finish each webinar. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And I will
Thank you.
say goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.